our special guests. Carter Wilson is the USA Today bestselling author of 9 critically acclaimed standalone psychological thrillers. He is an ITW Thriller Award finalist, a 5-time winner of the Colorado Book Award, and his works have been optioned for television and film. Dynamic and compelling, he now hosts his own podcast, Making It Up, which you can see on carterwilson.com. Interviewing authors like S.A. Cosby, Daniel Handler, Stuart Turton, Zio Axelrod, I got that one, and Julie Clark to Talk Shop, and Rip an Original Story Live. The result is a charming, authentic peek into the writing process. Carter lives outside of Boulder, Colorado. Arlene H. Cogdell, who is our moderator today, reviews mystery fiction for the Sun Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale and Tribune Publishing Wire, Publishers Weekly, and Shelf Awareness. She has been honored with the Raven Award from the Mystery Writers of America. Arlene is in her 8th year as a judge for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in the Mystery Thriller category. Arlene also has an essay on reviewing in the Anthony, Agatha, and Barry Award-winning book, How to Write a Mystery, co-edited by Lee Child and Lori R. King. And without further ado, please give a warm welcome to our guest, Carter Wilson.
Hello, everyone. And I love this event, bringing authors to readers. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being readers, for supporting libraries, and if you can, for buying books. Carter, this is the first time we've met, so welcome to Florida.
Thank you.
Thanks
to all of you. And I want to know what I have to do to get in your good graces, because now I just learned you're a judge in many different
Well, let's get on with it today. I like to bring authors and the readers back to the beginning of your career. As I understand it, we have boredom to thank for your books. You were working on a commercial real estate appraisal, and you had an 8-hour-long class on ethics, right? All you had to do was just kind of sit there and listen.
Right.
So you were, as I understand it, it was mind-numbing. So, of course, you started working on a mystery about killing people. Okay.
That's right.
You know, it was an exercise in creative writing. The happy ending wasn't that book got published, but it got you on the road to writing mysteries. Right. And as I understand it, then your 4th book was the one that really launched your career.
Right.
So let's hear it for boredom. And your 4th one was Final Crossing. What inspired you, besides boredom, to write that book?
Well, thanks for the question. So when I started writing, to your point, I had zero idea what I was doing. I never studied writing. I went to hotel school. I was in real estate, data consulting. And so I wrote this novel out of the blue, and I didn't tell anybody I was doing it because I was embarrassed, which is a common thread amongst authors you will find. And so I was fortunate enough to get an agent with that novel after like 75 rejections. Same agent I'm with today, actually, 22 years later. And then those first three books didn't sell. So what I started to do is I started to really study the rejections. And this was back when, these editors, if you have a decent agent, they're giving the novel to well-known editors who then will read it and give you like a full page of why they didn't like it or why it wasn't quite right for us. But there's gold in there.
Yeah.
There's gold in there. And so I would just study all dozens of rejection letters. And to your point, why did I write Final Crossing? The impetus of that book, it came to me, the through line of all these rejections was that my heroes were too weak. Oh, that's really interesting because I'm fascinated by weak heroes. I love weak heroes. And I don't want to term them weak. I'm fascinated by everyday people who have supreme challenges in front of them. And in order to get through these challenges, a lot of times they fail. That's interesting to me. But there's a way to do it where you're not just like, okay, this guy, I'm sick of this book because nothing ever happens. He keeps failing. So Final Crossing, I'm like, I am going to write a strong hero. That is the objective of this book. And so I maybe to the point of being a little cliched, but I'm like, I just want to see what, and then I really focused my energy on the villain in that book for my personal amusement. And then that sold to a very, very, very small publisher who had just incorporated maybe a year earlier and swiftly went out of business about 6 months after my book came out.
Oh, no.
So welcome to the publishing industry.
Welcome to the reality.
Yep.
Well, on a happier note, let's talk about your new book, which is Tell Me What You Did. The novel revolves around Poe Webb. She runs the top-notch podcast, which is called Tell Me What You Did. And she operates it out of her Vermont farmhouse. I promise no spoilers when we talk about the books. Callers are encouraged to tell their most embarrassing or a crime. And she promises that nothing, she doesn't promise them anonymity. She may even call the police about them. And sometimes they accidentally reveal their real names. And she offers two irresistible, yet opposing situations. The chance to make a confession without consequence, and the opportunity to have fame while being anonymous. That's very provocative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Tell Me What You Did is also about fighting back and about dealing with trauma. Tell us about your inspiration for that.
So I have a buddy a few years ago. We were always giving each other podcast recommendations. And he came up to me and he's like, you have to listen to this podcast. People can call in and they can leave a voicemail. And what they do is they leave an apology on this voicemail. And I guess the podcast plays these apologies. And my normal brain said, that's really cool. I want to listen to that. My thriller writer brain said, what if it was a confession? And I never write ideas down. And usually something occurs to me that might be a nugget for a story. And then if I'm still thinking about it 6, 8, 12 months later, then I'll write it. And this idea just kind of stuck to me. And so that was the inspiration for it. And I thought, what if they anonymously confess crimes? And it does play into the whole very American, I think, culture of I'm going to risk my personal freedom for 15 minutes of fame, hoping that, I'm on this top-ranked crime podcast, but then hope that nobody comes after me. And so it becomes a very popular podcast, and then Poe, the host, gets a caller who his confession is that he murdered her mother. And again, this is no spoilers. Poe knows her mother had been murdered. Poe actually witnessed this in person when she was only 13 years old. But she doesn't know if this is the guy because she actually hunted that guy down and killed him. So she's thinking, all right, who is this person? And if he is who he says he is, who did I kill? So that was kind of the setup for all of it. And then it just becomes a very creative cat and mouse kind of book after that.
Well, I like the fact that some of her readers are so savvy. They have actually found who these callers are and hunted them down, turned them over to the police, and I think they've arrested 3 murderers and 1 arsonist. And I love that she says, people will sacrifice so much to be on my show. I still don't get it. And, does that happen?
I think I exaggerated it a bit, but the part I'm very entranced by the general public's ability to sleuth. And there's a great documentary called Don't F with Cats. That is a prime example of this. It's like a community gets so outraged by what they've witnessed online, global community of people who don't even know each other, that they piece together every little detail to identify who this person is. And I just love, this ultimate crowdsourcing, right? Crowdsourcing to solve crimes, I think, is amazing. So I definitely want to have that be part of the book.
Well, true crime is very popular now. There's even a Saturday Night Live bit about women watching true crime murder shows. Why do you think people have such a fascination with that?
That's a good question. I know I have a fascination with it. I have my limits for sure. There's some things I just cannot watch. There's some things I can write, but I wouldn't want to read myself, which is weird. But
I guess that.
I think for me, so I usually write first person present tense, single person narrator. So I am in this person's head. And so I'm very, very, very close to whoever this protagonist is. And they go through some pretty horrible things. And as a writer, I'm able to kind of explore these places safely, but yet still be emotionally tied to it. And I think that's maybe the same experience for readers. Like if they're relatable enough, if you have an emotional connection to these characters, you can kind of go down this path, knowing you're safe, but seeing like, here's some dark stuff that it could happen to me. What would I do? And I think there's a fascination with the whole "what would I do?" So and I know that's what propels my writing. Is I'm constantly saying, "What would I do?" and then adding about 300% more bravery, and then that's usually the answer.
Well, actually, that leads to another question I had later on, but I think that you delve very deeply into your characters, and it's very much about relationships. Poe's relationship with her listeners, with her father, even with her mother, and with this murderer who comes on her fate. Talk about the relationships among your characters.
I mean, relationships are critical. I'm convinced, I really believe that for a solid thriller, I think it really needs to be emotion forward. Like not plot, not character, but really checking in every page. How is my character feeling? How are they, especially if she is telling the whole story from her point of view. And my books don't tend to have a lot of characters in them. So the relationships of those characters, through those relationships is where you reveal all the personality traits, all the human connection, like what are the stakes? What's the depth of your grief? Or how broken are you? And so it's very important to me when you only have a few characters is that you're understanding through their dialogue how they view your main character, because I think that's really where you can kind of reveal things without dumping a lot of exposition in.
I also like the relationship with her and her boyfriend, who I really liked, and her dog. Don't worry, the dog is fine throughout. Dog survives. That's very critical.
It is. I've learned my lesson on that.
But I just really like the relationship, and there was a really very centered in Poe, but she has a different relationship with each character.
Right, and it's when I first turned my draft into my editor, you get these editorial notes that are so scary, and it's a couple paragraphs like, "This is what I love, thank you. Here's 16 single-spaced type pages about what you might want to consider." And one of those was originally Poe's boyfriend, whose name is Kip in the book. He wasn't her boyfriend. He just worked for her. And I remember my editor saying, "I want to see more of him." And I said, because there are so few characters in the book. And so I really thought about that. I'm like, what if they were dating? And then I realized it was a fantastic opportunity to show fractures in their relationship because she's so guarded.
Yes. That
it comes to the point where he's saying, "I can tell you're holding things from me," which wouldn't have been able to do that were he was just her employee.
Right.
So it really changed the nature of, and it let me reveal a lot more things about Poe in that process.
But the podcast also, it's not just a job. It's a way of her dealing with guilt and grief.
Right.
Talk about how grief and guilt enter into the plot.
Yeah, I love writing about broken characters. I don't know why. My mother asks me all the time. She's convinced you write what you know, to which I've told her he could be a serial killer.
Yeah, do you know any?
Give me some credit for my imagination. But I write because I'm very fascinated by characters who are very gray. There's no villains, there's no heroes. Everyone's just different levels of gray, and I think that holds true to all of us. So what I like to do is I like to take a broken character who clearly needs healing and who is resisting that healing somehow, and then they're forced into it, usually through more trauma. And so kind of the idea of you can't get out until you go through it all. So Poe has been struggling. I mean, I had this idea, like, what if she were a 13-year-old and she literally witnessed the brutal slaying of her mother? What would that do to you? What are the psychological ramifications of that? What do you look like when you're 30 years old, having gone through that? What if you sought revenge and you murdered yourself? What are you left looking like? So I love that idea. And so to me, all of it is therapy for her. So she starts this podcast because she wants to talk to criminals. She wants to understand the criminal mind. She herself is a criminal, even though she sees it as, justified, vengeful killing. But it's really all coping mechanisms that she's not quite really willing to accept. And she doesn't want to go to therapy. So it's just like, this is what I do because this is now the world I kind of know. But the reality of it is she's trying to get to an end, which is usually, if not happiness, at least a hope of happiness. But she has all these things in front of her that she just has to force herself through.
You did something tell me what you did, I have never seen in a book. And that is you place QR codes not frequently, but every now and then in the book to kind of lead around the plot. You've used multimedia before in print books. Talk about this. I was just fascinated by it.
I love multimedia and it's all just to amuse myself. Like I've had websites built, fake websites that if you happen to, and I won't really even call it out, and if you happen to say, oh, I wonder if that's a real website, it'll lead you down a whole different path. I've had artwork commissioned for my books that's just placed in the pages because it's relevant to the story. And it's just, and my editor's like, sure, if you want to put that in there, that's great. And then I was writing this book. And so what Poe does when she's recording her podcast, she always agrees to delete the video file to protect their anonymity after, I think, 10 days or something. But what she doesn't tell them is she always records her side of the conversation with her iPhone, just over her monitor. So, and I was writing and she has these very fraught conversations while she's recording herself while she's doing a podcast. And I thought, I want to see what this looks like. And so I reached out to this actor who she had reached out to me a few years earlier. She had become a reader, and it was during the actor strike. And I'm like, hey, I don't know if this is cool or not, but can I pay you to do a couple scenes for me? All you have to do is record with your iPhone. It's totally non-produced because this is what it would be. And then and here are the pages of what your side of the conversation is, and you'll get the mood. And she recorded these scenes, sent them to me, and I'm like, this is amazing. So then I packaged all these videos up as recovered evidence from the Vermont State Police. And so when you scan it, it comes up, and you can watch Poe. And the book's been out for like a month, and I have 20,000 scans in those QR codes. And I also have a phone number in there that you can call if you try it, it works. And I get some really creepy messages because it's the villain's phone number. So people are texting him horrible things. That's just coming to my phone. I'm like, what? And I'm like, oh, that's the other number. But I love that stuff. And my editor hadn't seen QR codes before, but she's like, yeah, sure, we'll do it. And it just goes to some files on my Google Drive.
I was wondering how much response you got. It's apparently a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I did my acknowledgments as a video too, because sometimes I read a book and it would be kind of cool to see what the person looks like and if he's talking to you and this is why I wrote the book and here who I'm thanking. And so I don't know if I'll do it again, but it was fun to do.
But you've used multimedia before. Didn't you have drawings and a book?
Yeah, I had in Dead Girl in 2A, one of the conceits of the book was that there's this really, really creepy children's book that's almost hypnotic is the idea of it, is the way that it's drawn, the illustrations are so fine that it's kind of suggestive to these kids. And so I wanted to see what that looked like. So I hired an artist to create one of these images and, she did an amazing job. So the publisher was like, yeah, we can put that in the book. That's amazing.
That's really good.
But they don't ask me to do it. I just do it because, again, it amuses me.
Yes. And amuses your readers, too, I think. Now, you named Poe after Edgar Allan Poe.
Right.
Why?
I'm a big Poe fan. I've got a big raven tattoo on my arm.
Oh, and I won the Raven.
Oh, there you go. I've always been a big Poe fan. I think it suggests kind of darkness. Her actual name is Dylan Poe, Dyllan. And I remember thinking also, I remember when my agent first read it, she's like, oh, I didn't even know Poe was a woman until like page 70. And then this is before she was dating Kip. Not that that would have mattered. But I kind of like that. I kind of like that idea that it didn't matter. It didn't matter. And my agent didn't like that answer at all. She's like, it does matter. So it was a little bit androgynous in the nomenclature of the name. And that was just, and I didn't necessarily have an image of Poe in my head. I just had an image of a human, but I didn't really know what gender they were. So it kind of started out just almost shielding the gender in a way.
Okay. Now, tell me what you did is your 10th book?
It's my 10th, yeah.
When you started this journey, did you ever think you would reach 10 books? And they're probably successful, too.
When you start writing and you don't know what you're doing, for me, it was all about not small goals, but I remember my first goal was to get an agent, and having somebody who's not in my family say it's a good book.
Yeah.
Because you have this massive amount of insecurity, especially with zero training, having written nothing really besides real estate appraisal reports.
Those are dynamic.
Right. Although can be very fictitious.
That's true.
And then you get an agent and you're like, I just want to have one book published, so I can show my kids, and then you start, building on that. And I remember it got to a point where I'm like, I just want to get a little bit bigger with each book. You'd be fool to publish your first book and be like, I can't wait for this to become a New York Times bestseller. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do. So you set these small goals, and then you kind of realize over time, the goals are great, but the writing is where the joy exists. And so you focus on the writing and you do everything you can to support the book, but you don't really think about it all that much, if that makes sense. What I look forward to every day, I write an hour a day. What I look forward to every day is sitting down and what happens today? Because I don't know. That's my joy. And I think if you focus on that as a writer, and you do it consistently, 365 days a year, good things will happen without you focusing on waiting for those good things to happen, if that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. I totally agree. I think authors who are focused on how many awards they've won or that they've been on the New York Times bestseller, they start phoning it in. And you can tell in their books they're not as invested as they should be.
Right.
And I think readers also understand that. So I totally applaud that.
Right. How often do we read books where it's the seventh in a series and you start looking at it like, if this were a debut novel, it probably wouldn't have sold.
Exactly.
And that's
exactly.
But it's a New York Times bestseller because their earlier ones were like that. And I always find that fascinating because it's it's incredibly tough to get published. It's incredibly tough to get an agent these days, probably more so than ever. Mm-hmm. So, to me, it's such a privilege and an honor to be published. And I realized writing that book after that class 22 years ago that, if I could do this with my life, it would be a full life. And that's the most meaningful thing to me.
Podcasts are very popular now. Now, I admit I don't always listen to them. I'm just reading. And you have a podcast called Making It Up, in which you talk with authors about not so much their book, but their inspiration and where their creativity comes from. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I started it about 4 years ago. I'm a big fan of Mark Barron's podcast, podcasts where you're interviewing people, but it's not about a particular project. It's about their journey. Mm-hmm. What was your big break? What were some of your biggest failures? What surprised you? Why did you want to do this? So I wanted to bring that kind of thought process to a conversation between writers. So I interview writers from, Obviously, you start with your community, so there's a lot of crime writers, but nonfiction writers, science writers, people who just love the written word. It's amazing to talk to these people because everybody is so different and has such a different journey, and there's some kind of through lines between them all. But everybody on my podcast is forced at the end. I pick a random book from my bookshelves. I make them pick a page. I pick a random sentence and I read that sentence, and then we have to make up a short story starting with that sentence.
Oh, what a good exercise.
So that's the making it up part. So it's like improv. I have to do it every time, and I get nervous. And you get these like mega best-selling writers on there, like, oh my God, I don't know how to do this. I'm like, come on, we got this. But it's really fun because sometimes you have this like total mind meld with somebody, and you just both know where the story is going.
And the crime podcasts are very popular. Again, why are people so invested in those?
I think people are, it's like being asked, why do you write dark things? And I think everybody has this sense of darkness about them, the sense of curiosity or morbidity, and just some show it more than others, I don't think I'm particularly more interested in true crime than the average person. I just happen to write about it. So I think people just like to explore the dark side itself. They have that place of safety when they, or maybe they don't. I get a lot of people who email me and tell me I've given them nightmares, which is high praise for.
I was about to say that's a compliment.
But it ruined their night.
During the course of a novel or a series, characters have to change. They have to have an arc. I would think that in the course of writing, authors themselves have to change. How have you changed, either in the approach to writing or storytelling, since you began?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I've changed immensely, right? That's good. When I first started writing, we were pregnant with our first kid, and now my kids one just finished college. So when you're writing those early books, as a father of young children, you have a totally different viewpoint about. Strangely, that's probably some of my darkest stuff. But you obviously have little kids in your books, and you're very protective of those characters, and then that changes over time. I think for me as a writer, I think what I've learned, and now I teach writing as well, and this is also what I teach, is to just, there is a way that you go about writing that you have to discover that will be totally organic to you, that will be meaningless to other people, and you find that way and you trust it. Whether that means in my case, I don't know what I'm doing with every book. I don't outline, and you get all these instructions about characters have to change. It's got to be a hero's journey. It's got to be a 3-act structure. The inciting incident has to happen by page 22. Whatever it is, you fight that. I fought that for a long time, and I eventually just threw all that out the window. Like, no, I'm going to write whatever comes to my brain next. And I'm going to trust that. And that doesn't mean it doesn't change. That doesn't mean it doesn't get heavily edited. But that's how I approach a story. The last book I wrote, the one after this, making it up as you go along. And I halfway through, I went back and I read it just to remember what I had written, but not change anything. And then I finished the book. And then I went back and really read it for the first time. But I never went back in increments. I never edited along the way. And there were some big problems with it that I changed. But there was also this, you let your subconscious just come out. So that's kind of the way I've changed the most, is just trusting that story.
Are you a full-time writer?
I have a few different jobs.
Okay.
I had a corporate job until a couple of years ago, so I'm not there anymore. I have the writing. I have a company called Unbound Writer, which does coaching, retreats, seminars, self-guided online classes. And then somebody I used to work with in the corporate world, she and I have a partnership that we do consulting. We have our own consulting company in the hospitality industry. So between all three of those things, you just try to make it work. But writing is not for the faint of heart. if that is what you're relying on for income. So it's a terrible thing to get into if that's what your goal is, to make money from it.
When you start a new book, what inspires you? The plot, the setting, the characters?
It's the mood.
Okay.
Like every book of mine has a mood, and I always write it down. I have a side Word document that I keep notes on. And I remember with it, I just looked at this the other day for Tell Me What You Did. And the first sentence says, "This is an angry book.
Yes.
This should be a scary book." And I knew kind of the conceit of the podcast, that it was you could confess crimes anonymously, but that's all I knew. So then you sit down with this idea of like anger, and I'm like, well, who's angry? Maybe the podcast host is angry. Why is she angry? Well, let's explore that. So that's how it all. So I didn't even know who the host was. I just knew that anger, that the book was. And I don't even know why the book had to be angry, but that was maybe my mood at the time. And I knew it was going to be a propulsive book. I will say that the book that came out before this was a real struggle. It was a very complex book, told from the point of view of a 21-year-old savant. And it was based in 1987, and there were so many rewrites with it. And my editor and I really went back and forth on it. I actually changed the tense of the book. So I think that's why I was angry. I'm like, all right, this next book is going to be in your face, angry, straightforward, non-complex. And I had fun writing it, and I was amazed by the reception. I mean, this book in 1 month has outsold all my other books.
Wow. And the name of it?
Tell Me What You Did. And I'm like, why did this book tap into?
No, that's the new book. The other book that you're just.
Oh, the old book that I struggled with was The Father She Went to Find. And it's funny, and I love that book. I think it's some of my best writing. It was received okay. It got great critical reviews, but sold okay. It didn't sell amazing. And then I rewrite this fierce book, and people are like, yep, that's the book.
Because Tell Me What You Did is doing really well, right?
Yeah, it's now it's 5th week in the Publisher's Weekly bestsellers list.
That's wonderful.
So,
that's wonderful.
And I've never hit that list before, and now it's 5 weeks on it. So I'm like, why? What is it? And the danger is trying to understand, because you think, well, is it because it's a podcast? Is that interesting? And there's a bunch of podcast books out there. But I think what you want to resist is trying to replicate that, because that never works. Mm-hmm. From what I've witnessed from others.
Now, do you know the ending when you first start?
I don't know the middle. I usually don't know more than. I mean, the ideas literally come out as I write. I was writing something today. I'm just working on something. I'm like, what if he just, it just occurred to me, what if he just found a kitten in a box? What would that do? And so I'm like, he finds a kitten, a stranded kitten in a box. And that scene might totally just go away. But now I'm thinking, I never would have been able to outline that, but I'm like, it reveals a lot about what choices he makes to take in a stray animal. And while his whole life is falling apart around him. So I have an idea of where a scene is going, and then it can just totally change. And then I'll sit there and think oh, is that interesting? Is that compelling? And if it's enough to me, then I'll go down that road. And again, I might go back and this makes no sense. You got to get rid of the kitten. So
that kitten, if you get rid of it.
Well, I mean,
it's in that book.
Not get rid of a kitten. Just get rid of the scene where he finds him. I had a book, The New Neighbor. It was The Dead Husband, actually, where a dog dies in the book. It's a dog we've never seen before. It's actually just a conversation between two cops saying, hey, we found this dead dog. It looks like it had been intentionally killed. That was it. And the reactions, it were like the Goodreads warnings about animal abuse and torture. I'm like, what? But people, thank you, I will never read this author. And so I'm sitting, and you don't ever reply to reviews. But I did write a whole article in Writer's Digest about why it's okay to kill animals in books. Because
that endeared you to people.
I'm like, look at John Wick, a $1 billion franchise predicated on the death of a puppy. So, but like, you do, and now it's to the point where, and I'm a big animal lover, and I have animals in a lot of my books, and you almost do want, at the very beginning, an author's note. Like what you just said at the beginning of this conversation, the dog's going to be fine.
I often will put that in my review if the dog is prominent, because I know readers want to know that.
Right.
And I know some readers will stop.
Yeah, I get emails from people asking me, hey, I'm halfway through, is the dog going to be okay? And I will email them back. I'm like, yep, the dog, I learned my lesson. But, so.
I can't watch Old Yeller ever again.
Right, well, no, that's a traumatizing
Even though that
experience.
was, part of the whole thing. Are you ever inspired by real crimes?
Yeah, a couple times. I mean, the inspiration comes in when you least expect it, like the podcast story. But like my fifth book, Mr. Tender's Girl, who actually has a character who appears in Tell Me What You Did. I remember reading about the Slender Man stabbings in 2013 in Wisconsin. These two 13-year-old girls stabbed a classmate like 30 times. And I remember reading this article when it came out, and I got about 3 paragraphs in, and I see that this victim survived, this poor girl, and I stopped reading, and I'm like, I'm going to write about this, and I'm not about the crime. I'm so fascinated by like, what does this girl look like as a 28-year-old? So I place it as so, and I never followed that story because I didn't want to be influenced by it. But sometimes there's that, it hits you of like, what does this person look like? I'm so fascinated by who you are after going through something like that. So once in a while that'll poke at you. And then it gets a little bit weird because, the public, that was a popular crime, if you want to call it that. So then they want to put on the back cover, inspired by true events, which I think is fine, but you feel a little gross about it because you're like, I'm not trying to exploit this family at all. And I didn't even read the art. I want you to understand, I don't know anything about this case except for the first 3 paragraphs of an AP story. But you hope that it doesn't feel like you're sensationalizing that kind of a thing.
Now, do you do research for your books, and has anything really surprised you?
I don't do much. It feels like homework to me. I have friends, and you know, I'm sure many authors who the reason they write is so they can research.
Yeah.
They just love my good friend Barbara Nicholas is like this.
Oh, right.
She'll travel the world just in the name of research, and to me, it's just a lot of work. And you're usually I'm writing somebody. Again, first person present tense. You're just seeing through her eyes. She's not an FBI agent. She doesn't have a specialized job. If she turns the corner and somebody's holding a gun at her, she's not identifying the type and model of the gun. She's like, there's a gun in my face, because she's kind of an ordinary person. So it doesn't beget a lot of research. But then you get to certain scenes, certain locations where you absolutely have to jump online. And so, thriller writers' internet history is pretty telling. But there's not even really that. So it'll be that it's the little details. It's the I'm setting something in New Hampshire. I don't really know New Hampshire. What are the supermarkets there? Oh, Hannaford's. Okay, what does the Hannaford's look like? Or I'm doing something in the 80s. Did this video game come out by the time I'm writing this book? So all those little things, because your copy editors will 100% fact check everything you do to make sure it's all true. But it just has to be enough to give an accurate flavor, I think, to the readers.
Yeah, I didn't hear you. I'm going to ask you one more question. I have more, but then I'm going to hear from you all. As a writer, what are you most proud of?
Goals. Pride is a very difficult emotion for a writer. And I don't mean to belittle anything that but it's really hard to sit back and look at your body of work like, I did this, I did that, because you do go through so much self-doubt on your journey. And that's all. I wouldn't, if you asked me at a party, you just met me, what do you do? Yeah, even after my third book hit the USA Today bestsellers, I wouldn't have said I was a writer. I would have said my corporate job, because that's where I make the money. And then maybe I would have thrown that in, but I would have thrown it in such a belittling way that they wouldn't have followed up with questions on it. And that's, I think, is completely wrong. I think writers should have a lot more pride. That's one of the things that I teach. I think I am most proud about having written that first book and taking the time to be curious about why it happened. Like, why did this life event happen to me? It literally came out of nowhere, and I followed up on it, and I remember really taking the time to be curious about it and saying, is this something I should be doing with my life? Even though everything I've done in my life has not prepared me for this direction. And I chose to go down that path. And I'm so grateful that I did that, because you just never know what the world has in store for you. And I think that's just such a lovely thing. And I think when opportunities present themselves, it's so easy to turn a blind eye to it and not be curious about it and just move on with what you think the path should be. So when I look back, I'm like, I'm really glad I did that.
What about you all? Any questions from the readers here? Yes, ma'am.
My question is, how do you deal with creative blocks if you're attempting to start a new project and all of a sudden you kind of stall a little bit and don't know how to get out of that?
Your question was about creative blocks. I'm not a big believer in blocks. My friend Ramon always says, it's not like, a surgeon says, I'm feeling surgeon's block today, so we're not going to operate on it. I think a block is something else that you're not addressing. And when I work with students and they're really struggling with a block, I'm like, let's explore this. How do you feel about your story? How do you feel about your characters? Is this really the story you want to write? What's really difficult, I think, for authors is they think they have the idea, and it might be a great idea, but they deep down don't have the passion for that idea, and they're unwilling to admit it. Because abandoning a good idea or abandoning 20,000 words of a story is really, really hard. Because you're like, what if I don't have another idea? And what that does is it just creates this bottleneck in your head where it almost makes you not have any other ideas. So I'm a big believer in just letting go, being very honest with yourself. I write 365 days a year. I just finished a book. The next day I started writing something new. I didn't really know what it was going to be about. Let me just write 2 paragraphs. Maybe that'll start. It'll come. I trust that it'll come. My advice to writers is to always really investigate. Don't even call it a what. Why are the ideas not coming? Because we're all creative people. Ideas come all the time. So it's just where you seek your passion behind it.
Michael Collin once said that he threw out 250 pages of a book and just started from scratch. And I thought, my God, Michael Collin's worst book is probably better than some people's best.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. But you never have that sense when you're writing it. Like, even the best writers in the world, they doubt. And I usually don't sell multiple book contracts because I never tell my editor what I'm working on, because I usually don't know what I'm working on. So I sell one book at a time, and you finish the book, and like, I have zero idea if this is good or not. I think it's good, but you send it to the agent, and you don't know what they're going to say. So I've just learned over time just to trust your instincts and write from a place of joy. And then I do think good things will happen.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I think it was mentioned in the introduction that one or more of your books has been optioned, possibly for film. I'm curious, when you're writing,
if that's ever something you think about, hey, this might make a good movie also, or how do you feel about your creative product being then sold to a group, a movie group, who's going to have control as to how your baby, so to speak, is going to be viewed?
Well, as my agent would say, just take the money and don't think about it. I mean, it's such a fickle process. I had Mr. Tender's Girl's been under option since 2018. And, you know, it's at the point now where they've actually attached a showrunner and they're pitching it to streaming services as a 3-season series. But you never, I mean, the odds that anything actually ever happens are so low that you just kind of have fun little thoughts about it, but like, that's about it. And you get told, like, you know, it'll totally change if it ever gets actually put out there. And of course you want it to be true to the story as much as possible, but I haven't gone through that yet, so I don't know.
I'm curious how much power the actual author gets to wield. I guess it's based on your contract or how it was.
Right. Yeah, and that's actually all established with the option contract. And it's very little. I mean, unless you're obviously like a Stephen King or something like that. But yeah, I mean, they put in there like, where is your name going to appear in the title sequence? And then they'll usually add in something like, you know, like we might say, well, we want to be able to possibly be hired to consult on the project. So you add that in there, but that doesn't mean they have to hire you. They can just, you know, they're like, well, we're making this, and your name will be in the title sequence, but that's it, and you just accept that.
I think there's a general consensus that most folks that have read the book first all say the book was so much better.
Yeah, I think that's pretty true, and you know, you realize, well, once it comes down to something that's being produced, it's not a writer; it's a writer's room, right? So, it's easy to dilute that, you know, a writer's flavor when you have 10 people suggesting different things that might be more palatable for, you know, a viewing audience than a reading audience. So we'll see. Who knows?
And I think those that go on streaming services like Bosch, I know Michael Colley has a lot to say about how his books are used. And there'll be like 2 or 3 of the books into one series, one season. And again, it depends on the influence of the author and how big they are.
Great.
And some you just like, was this the same book?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
When you're writing, are you sitting at a desk, or are you like borrowing when you're writing, and what tools do you use to write? Like, do you start out with pencil? Do you write?
I could never handwrite. I handwrite a grocery list and my hand starts cramping up. So it changes over the years. I used to have a whole drinking routine around writing. Like I've got to write with my vodka gimlet at 5 p.m. and this and that. And then a couple of years ago, I'm like, why am I drinking? So I stopped. But now I mostly actually write in a Starbucks. I go, there's a Starbucks in my town. I go there at 8 in the morning, 7 days a week. They see me walk in. They know what drink to start making because I'm there all the time, and I'm there for an hour. And then I just have a laptop like in my lap physically, and I just kind of throw in the headphones. I usually listen to like thunderstorm sounds, and then I just kind of sit there for a little while and try to distract myself. And then I'm like, all right, let's get at this. And when I write, it's mostly a 500 to 700 word daily goal, which can take 20 minutes, you know, but I never go more than an hour. And then when I'm editing, it's about, 45 minutes to an hour. Then I'm a big believer in not forcing things. Sometimes and I have many friends who will write 6, 7, 8 hours a day, which is just not how my brain works. Because I think after a while, you start to feel like, now I'm just putting words down. And I don't know if I'm really propelling the story. So I'm more consistent than I am volume on a daily basis.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a quick question about, you mentioned earlier
it's tough to get an agent, it's tough to get published. So what are your thoughts about indie or self-publishing and medium and such?
Yeah, I'm all for indie and self-publishing. I never went that route, and I don't know if I ever would have, even if I kept getting rejected, just because I was so insecure. I did need that third-party confirmation. I would recommend to authors who are considering that, because this is what you hear a lot. 100 rejections from agents. I don't know what else to do. My advice would be, all right, what's your next book? If you love writing, keep at it, and maybe, it just takes time. But some people are like, no, this book needs to be out there. And that's fine. I would highly recommend hiring developmental editors, copy editors, because once your work is out there, it's out there. Warts and all. So if you then, with your next book, try to get an agent, they can go look at what your first book was. And, they might say, well, you already have something out there that's not great. Maybe you should change your name, your pen name. That's a real thing. So you just want to be very thoughtful about it, because when your book doesn't sell or doesn't get an agent, there's a reason for that. That doesn't mean it's necessarily logical, but you are talking to people who are constantly taking the pulse of the market. It could be your book is great. It's just not coinciding with what market trends are, which is very frustrating because you've spent all this time on this book. But I like to think I get better with every book. And, people say, why didn't you self-publish those first 3 books? I don't want them out there. There's a reason they didn't sell. They were learning experiences for me, and I needed those, but I would never go back to those.
What is your next book? Can you say?
I don't know.
Oh, you said you finished. You finished?
Whether it gets sold or not. So it's funny. It's called All Her Fury. It's also an angry book, so maybe there's a trend. But the conceit, and it's funny. Like, I didn't tell my agent what I was writing. It's kind of the first time I've done that, because I just didn't know. Because the whole story takes place in 5 hours, and I'm writing it. And I'm like, I don't know if I have enough here. And I needed to finish the book, so she's reading it right now, actually. So I have no idea what she thinks about it, and then I have no idea if the publisher's going to want it. I would like to think they would, but I just had this thought about. I had this idea about this woman in Miami, actually, who, through her husband, they get into some trouble, and then her husband gets murdered. And that she seeks vengeance on the person who murdered her husband, but it's kind of gang related. So she takes her daughter and just moves to this tiny, tiny, tiny little mountain down in Colorado, where kind of everybody has a secret. And she's been living there for years, waiting for these people to find her. And then these hitmen come, but they're actually there for somebody else, and they just get the wrong house.
Oh.
And so I kind of thought, like, well, what, it's 2 days before Christmas, and there's a massive snowstorm, and all of a sudden these 3 men in their house, but they're not there for good. And that was what occurred to me. So I'm like, well, then what happens?
That clicks a lot of boxes.
But it was the fastest I've written something in a long time. It took me about 6 months to do the first draft of it. And it just felt, it's very propulsive, and it's very angry. She just wants to be left alone with her daughter. And she's like, why won't people leave me alone? So hopefully next year we'll be having a conversation about it.
I hope so. Other questions? I'll get to you. Yes, ma'am. You first. Good.
You talked about a strong character. How do you make a character stronger?
Well, that's a good question. I never want to start with a character who's got all the answers. I want somebody who's like me, who's just like, I'm faced with something that is overwhelming to me. Like, if I walk down the street and somebody just came up and open palm slapped me, that would be traumatic for me, right? So I think about characters that, like, I don't want to throw so much dark stuff at them that they just crumble, but I want them to be challenged enough where they feel like, oh, I know how to fight back. I've just never done it. So it's very important that, to me, that characters almost look like they don't have any agency at the beginning, that their things are just happening to them, but then they start to learn, like, no, I control my destiny. I might be scared of that destiny, but I can control it, and I'm going to start fighting back, and I'm not going to take this anymore. That to me is fascinating, because it's kind of a fantasy for all of us a little bit when you feel maybe helpless at times. But giving a character agency, making them, having that shift from things happening to them doing things, that's pivotal, and that needs to usually happen not too late in the book, because your readers are going to get frustrated.
This person here, and I'll get to you.
So you said that this book had a lot of anger in it, and this next book also a lot of anger. Don't you feel drained, or do you feel drained when you get to the end of that with all that anger coming down?
Yeah, endings are tough, because my endings, and you never know if an ending's going to resonate. I probably had more positive reviews about this ending, Tell Me What You Did, than any other book. A lot of my endings are opaque, but to me, they're always hopeful. So at the end of the book, I am emotionally drained. I'm actually emotional, it's funny, like, my partner says this all the time, like, I'll go through a period of a few weeks after I finish something, just kind of down. And it's because you kind of miss your characters, but it's just kind of this, you're just recovering in a way. But to me, they're always, I don't know if they're happy endings. I think that they are. I think they're probably happier than what people tell me that they are. But as long as they have hope. So at the end, the anger's gone. Or at least there's a sense of, happiness in the future. So you're kind of excited that for your characters to be through what they've been through. But yeah, there are scenes that, you finish and you realize, like, I wrote a really dark scene because that dark scene was absolutely necessary to propel this book forward. But it sticks with you. Sometimes, and sometimes you write something like, oh, I feel kind of gross, and maybe I don't need to go into all that detail, but that's just what kind of came out of me, and so that's when you sometimes need that feedback from your agent, editor, beta readers, be like, this was too much, and then you go and edit it down a little bit. She had a question.
This lady here.
Actually, I was going to get something that's similar to the ending, but it seems like when you're writing, you don't have you have an idea to start, but it seems like what you're saying and what most of what you said is you don't actually have the ending in your mind.
Right.
And my question is, at what point you're writing? I have read, and I read a lot, and one thing that's very frustrating is like an author will, at the last chapter, throw all the endings in, they lose, and some of the details aren't tied up.
Right.
So how do you know at what point that you're writing, do you recognize that I need to be ending this, but do you also go back and read to make sure all your loose ends, so to speak, are tied up?
Yeah, you have to. And that's a great question about tying up loose endings. It's weird, especially when you're not outlining. I never feel like, okay, this book is going to be 85,000 words, so I need to make sure I'm sectioning everything. I don't think like that. But all my books end up being about 85,000 words, whether it's just this natural, weird occurrence. And about 70% in, you start thinking, oh, maybe this is how it ends. And I'm not writing mysteries, so it's not like I'm unveiling a killer. A person who was a barista in chapter 3, you realize that something's up with that person, and maybe they come into the ending. Then you start thinking, oh, okay, now I have to go back and layer in more stuff about them. And that's where you get, writing is a solitary thing for a while, and then it's a group project. Nobody else does the writing for you, but you get plenty of feedback before it gets published about things that work and things that don't work. And so, you might be foreshadowing too much, and so you got to take some stuff out because people are guessing things that you don't want them to guess. But yeah, tying up those things is absolutely critical. But readers, every person has a different perception on what needs to be tied up, right? So what annoys you might not annoy the next reader. And so that's frustrating as a writer. So that's why the writer just has to write for them, I believe, write for themselves. What works for you as the writer, and then just obey. Because yeah, you'll like, what happened to this? What happened to that? And like, well, they were never that. I didn't mean them to be important. That being said, I do think every character, if you introduce a character, unless it is literally just a transactional conversation, it has to be thoughtful. Like, why are they there? What's their story? And you might not even write much about it, but you have to know what their deal is.
I want to thank everyone for coming. There is a pamphlet over here about more upcoming author events. Carter will be signing over here. Please buy books over here. And thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful event to talk to authors. Thank you, and thank you, Carter.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.